All right, we're live at DEF CON. We got Arctic Mine over here. How's it going?
Very good.
Are you enjoying the conference?
Yes, I am.
Were
It's
you
very
able, before we get into the talk that you did today, were you able to experience DEF CON beyond Monero at all? Beyond the Monero Village?
To be honest, no.
Yeah, either was I. That's why I'm asking. It's been intense just being here. For those of you that are watching that have never been to DEF CON, I don't know, how would you explain it?
Well, there's just way too much for a very limited amount of time. Everything's happening at the same time. And I came here primarily for the village, and that was my objective. So, yeah, I mean, very little outside of the village.
Yeah, I think it's like 20,000 people or something that attend this thing. It's a massive amount of people, and it's very cool for Monero, and that we have this village here. And it's not, for me, it's not so much about. Obviously, it's great to talk to people like you and the people that are in the Monero community, but it's also great to be able to talk to people that don't know about Monero at all, that are here for other reasons, and they're kind of coming through just to check out the Monero village. It's a great way to kind of get the message out about Monero.
Well, that's really good. I mean, and I did get a chance to talk to people in the community, but also people that are new to it. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So let's get into the talk. So you want to give a quick kind of rundown of what you went over today in your talk?
Well, yeah. I mean, I went over the fee structure in Monero and the penalty and how it works, and the changes that have taken place since last year. And in fact, since I had a talk with you, I think in the fall of last year, and there were some critical changes that have happened since then. Of what I mentioned, and then I covered how what this tells us about other coins and about Monero in general. And the gist of the conclusion.
What were those critical changes that happened?
Well, the first one that has happened is in Monero, we added the long term median. It essentially prevents a fast growth of the blockchain. It's a kind of thing that realistically will rarely be triggered because it's basically an anti spam thing. The fees, there was a modification to the fees, how they're calculated, which also, because now you have the long term median, we can use that to determine fees. And it allows that when you have a sharp rise in demand, then your fees don't go down right away. And that's the main change that takes place. There's a delay until the long-term medium kicks in before the fees start to move.
So those are the changes that were made in Monero. And then the basis of your talk today was, I guess, about comparing essentially Monero to other coins, and in particular Bitcoin, and how it's architected and how it has the tail emission, which allows us to not rely on transactions to maintain the security of the network.
Actually, the first coin I talked about was Bytecoin, which I mentioned in the last, I think, not second last interview I did with you. And what has happened since then is they have abandoned the crypto node formula. In fact, the reason they had to abandon it is because their block reward fell to something. It was 800, around 800, when they did it, BCN, which if you translate it into Monero is something like 0.08, so roughly about 13% of the Monero tail emission. And they had to give up. And so what they did is they made the minus boat on it. So essentially, you do not have a crypto node formula anymore. What you have is a minus of boarding on the median, and then they essentially effectively set the fees. Now, it's no secret that a lot of the ASICs that were kicked off the Monero network ended up in Bytecoin. So effectively, the block size is controlled by one company. So it's essentially centralized or cartel, which is kind of the prediction is. And then if it then...
So that's perhaps indicative of what we might see in other coins like Monero. So this coin is kind of the canary in the coal mine and showing of what can go wrong if you don't have a tail emission built into the structure of your coin. Is that correct?
Very much so. In fact, the canary is dead. And that's the analogy. And it's a couple of reasons why. Bitcoin had a really fast drop in the block reward, so it kind of accelerates the whole thing. There's a lot of history in it, which is not, there was a pre-mine, and then it was hidden as a Nina mine, and they had to do it over 2 years, and they wanted 83%. So that kind of forces low emissions. So it created the perfect, basically, canary in the coal mine to look at this issue because it accelerated what's coming down the pipeline. And the conclusion, really, in a crypto node type formula is that you get either a centralized cartel or a tragedy of the commons, and so it cannot support the Satoshi fee market. Now, where it gets interesting is when we start talking about Bitcoin, and in particular the big Bitcoin, something like Bitcoin Satoshi Vision. Now there, you have the fixed block size, which is about what you need to do in order for the Satoshi fee market to even have a chance. So you have to stay with the 1 megabyte block size in order to give this thing a chance. If you look at something that's weaker than Monero, and that's the comparison I made, because if Monero goes to zero and these problems happen, basically the fees go to zero. That means the essence of what happens. Then if the fees go to zero, then if you got a weaker penalty than Monero, it's the same thing that's going to happen. So the fees are going to go to zero. So if you look at something like Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, with its essentially infinite block size, they just mined a 210 megabyte block, and essentially no other restrictions on the block size. Well, how are you going to have a fee market? Well, you're not. And so essentially what you'll see is the same thing that happened in Bitcoin. It'll go to zero. And either you'll get a mining cartel, it'll last for a while, and then you'll have a problem of essentially a tragedy of the commons. Now, we're talking billions of dollars in money here. So this is not a trivial issue. And the essence of the conclusions that I have is you end up with a lot of questions and no answers. So Monero can say, well, we sidestep this entire issue with a tail emission, but all these other coins, pretty well anything has got a finite number of coins and a falling block reward. And this is a lot of coins. They're either going to have to really restrict the block size and maybe still it won't work, or they're going to end up with essentially a tragedy of the commons or a cartel. And that's not a pretty thing to have to say. So I kind of like the messenger with a very, how shall I put it, an inconvenient truth would be a good analogy that a lot of people don't want to hear.
They can't handle the truth.
Well, the truth is, implication in the truth is that there's a lot of money at risk here. That's what the implication in the truth is. And it's a question, and it's questions, because, I mean, my argument would be, if you want to secure billions of dollars of funds, then the onus has to be on those who want to do that to show that you actually have a solution to this problem.
Well, that's what I don't understand. So kind of the meme in Monero, in Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin is digital gold, and that what they consider the most important thing is security, which is, for example, the reasoning they give as to why they're not so concerned about implementing something like, Ring CT, because they rather make sure that the coin is auditable versus risking that. So it's security first. So with that in mind, then why, if Bitcoin's all about security first, why are they okay with not having a tail emission and risking the future security of the coin? I find that, to me, that seems hypocritical. If their main concern is security, how are they okay with not ensuring that the future of the coin will be secure? It's just a thought that I constantly have about that.
Because the 21 million maximum number of Bitcoin is a very cherished element of the Bitcoin social contract. And it's one thing that everybody sort of in consensus in Bitcoin isn't prepared to change. So their approach to security is we want to increase the block size. So they go in with a 1 megabyte block size and just hope that
the security is potentially at risk there, right? Given that we're going to be relying on transaction fees to secure the network.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely, it's at risk. It's totally unproven. I mean, it was mentioned in the Satoshi paper, and a comment that I made in the talk is just because you make a statement and you embed it in a work of genius, but let me be blunt. I mean, this is essentially what Satoshi paper is, does not make the statement true and does not prove the statement. And that's exactly what we have here. No, very few people are standing up and questioning the viability of the so-called Satoshi fee market.
Plato got a lot of things wrong. He got a lot of things right, but he also got a lot of things wrong, given the knowledge he had at the time.
That's exactly correct. And I think this is what this is coming down to. You hear, like, are you sure there's somebody else starting a new coin that's going to do the same thing? Maximum number of coins. It sells very well. Trust me. And they're going to turn around and then have a falling block reward. Okay, well, nobody's answered the question. And because you're kicking the can down the road, Bytecoin is kind of an exception because Bytecoin pushed the thing really accelerated in order to do their pre-mine. But in general, you're kicking the can down the road. People are not necessarily going to worry what's going to happen in 24 years from now. So let's say 2043. And an example that I looked at with a fee-based coin is what happens on Christmas Day. I mean, if your fee levels if your transaction levels drop for a day, is that vulnerable to a 51% attack? Because that's when you don't want to do it. And then you sort of calculate what's the block reward going to be, say, in 2043. And the reason I picked 2043, it happens to be the 200th anniversary of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. So it's not the 300th anniversary, like 2143, which a lot of people are thinking. It's a 200th anniversary. So it's 2043. And you're already looking at like a 0.8% of the existing block reward, for example, for Bitcoin SV. So there's a lot of questions and no answers.
So do you think Bitcoin can just continue to kick the can down the road, so to speak, or are people going to start to become more aware of this issue sooner than later? Will the market start to understand this, or it's something that that can kind of just be hidden because it doesn't really become an issue until the block reward ends?
Well, it doesn't really end. It just goes lower and lower and lower. Some people say the price is going to go up, but that's debatable. I think the real one thing that could possibly force this into an issue is if Monero sort of really starts getting a lot more traction based on privacy, and then people start looking at this question because it's being solved in Monero. And so that's one major factor, but hardly anybody's done that. I mean, and they're launching new coins with fixed maximum number of coins. So it's not the sort of thing that is very saleable. I mean, you can sell a fixed number of coins very well. It's tougher to say, well, our inflation rate is less than that of gold, which is essentially what Monero says. And so therefore, you still meet the definition of hard money because the gold standard for hard money is gold, and Monero's got a lower inflation rate than gold. Therefore, it can still meet that standard. Maximum number of coins, that sells very well.
It's easy to comprehend that for many people. That must be supply demand, maximum number of coins. So it's just going to have to continue to go up in value.
Exactly. Well, the problem is that it really doesn't work. It hasn't been proven to work, and we have no evidence that it works at all. And we're trying to secure billions of dollars worth of money with this thing. So you have an unproven hypothesis trying to secure $200 million billion in cryptocurrency or more. That's what we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was personally kind of one of my first major questions with Bitcoin when I first got into Bitcoin was, all right, well, what happens when the mining block reward ends, or diminishes enough?
Well, we're seeing the canary dead in the form of Bytecoin. So that's kind of a partial answer to the question. I think one possible scenario is a mining cartel followed by some kind of tragedy of the commons. Eventually, it's going to come down to that. I think the bigger issue is going to come up on coins like Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, especially and to a certain degree Bitcoin Cash, because they've really pushed the block reward argument, so there's very unclear how they're going to create scarcity in order to force those fees to go up. Bitcoin, on the other hand, and that's kind of, they'll say, well, some points we managed to get about 3 Bitcoins worth of fees. Okay, well, that's kind of roughly equivalent to where Monero is in a Stellar mission. So that is an argument that maybe they can do this, maybe not. It's unclear. What is clear is that Bitcoin has failed as a transactional currency with the exception of very large transactions. And I will caution that. It is still a very viable way of moving significant sums of money around.
Right, because it has the liquidity. But I feel like, that's kind of one of the major arguments for pro-Bitcoin is it has the liquidity and the network effect. But I feel like that's something that can be overcome with time. but there's other things that just can't be overcome if certain flaws that can't be changed with time. For example, Bitcoin's lack of fungibility, and like we're talking about, its lack of tail emission. These are things that are part of the social contract of Bitcoin that really can't be changed. But whereas something like, you look at Monero versus Bitcoin, and the argument against Monero and pro Bitcoin is that, well, Bitcoin has a network effect, it has liquidity, Monero doesn't. But isn't that just something that would come with time?
Yes, I mean, here's the problem. The first question is that Bitcoin basically cannot not handle the small transactions. There is a lot of myth around Lightning Network filling in this void, but Lightning Network needs to close the channels. And this is what I tell people: Lightning Network. So if you got a big escrow amount of sitting in your channel in order to close it, well, that kind of takes the advantage of Lightning Network out of this. Lightning Network's a great technology. Don't get me wrong, but it's not a replacement for scaling on the main chain, and that's a fundamental problem that Bitcoin has. The fungibility aspect, ironically, I don't think it's as serious, because if you had to solve the scaling problem, you could bolt on things like confidential transactions, and you could do this kind of stuff. I mean, that's how Monero did it. I mean, when we went and put in confidential transactions and blocks went to 13 kilobytes, well, the reason we could do that is because we have an adaptive block size, and we can actually handle the larger capacity until then Bulletproof comes around and drops the transaction sizes down. So if you look at even Bulletproof right now, we're looking at 2,600 bytes for a transaction, but this is what, maybe 500 for Bitcoin. It's 5 times the size. What happens if you now make the transactions in Bitcoin 5 times larger? Well, you're going to have a real problem with an overloaded network. So I would argue that one of the reasons why we haven't seen fungibility solutions that really work in Bitcoin is because it doesn't have the capacity to handle them.
Mm-hmm. And the politics as well, right?
Well,
like we said, the social contract aspect of it is preventing. So people kind of say, well, security first. The protocol has ossified. We're not about changing the protocol. Therefore, we're not willing to kind of edit it to add something like confidential transactions.
I think a lot of the problem in Bitcoin is nobody can really propose a solution to the problem, because the solution may not exist. And that the politics is driven to a very large degree, not by the personalities involved, but by the weakness in the protocol. So that's where I see the difference. So I don't think that, if Bitcoin had the scaling capability, I would not be surprised if things like confidential transactions would have been put in there, a good coin join solution. So the fungibility issue has been addressed. Well, people forget. Confidential transactions was designed for Bitcoin. It was implemented in Monero.
Correct. Right.
Coin join was designed for Bitcoin. It was implemented in Dash. When you think about this, so all these technologies are going somewhere else for a reason.
Right. Because they just can't be adopted into Bitcoin.
Basically, you don't have the capacity on the blockchain to do it because of these limitations, and that's what I'm saying, yeah.
All right. Well, this is great, as always.
Well, thank you.
Are you going to the party tonight? It looks like the pre-party has started. For those of you watching, the Monero Village behind us is filled with people who are getting ready for tonight's Monero party.
Well, that's a good opportunity to meet people and network. Yes, absolutely. I'll be going there.
All right. Nice seeing you, and I'll see you at the party.
Thank you.
Have a good one.